Validity theory and assessment. What is an assessment framework? According to the National Council on Measurement in Education, assessment frameworks provide details of the knowledge, skills, abilities, traits, interests, the process in which an assessment was validated, the competencies or the characteristics in which students will be assessed on a particular assessment. Assessment frameworks indicate how the assessment should be constructed and determines the ways in which the test scores are used. So, what is validity? According to the National Council on Measurement in Education, validity is the degree to which evidence and theory support the interpretation of test scores, meaning that there is a process that all assessments must go through before they are considered valid and are able to use within education. Assessments must have an established interpretation for use. If there are any issues regarding sampling and setting, that must also be noted within the validation process. And specific forms of validity must be adhered to before an assessment is considered valid. So, how do we know if an assessment is valid? Well, many instruments are considered valid when the measures in which they are intended to measure have been completed and gone through a thorough evaluation process. Validation begins with an explicit statement of the proposed interpretation of the test scores, along with the rationale for the assessment being valid. Validation is a process, and this process helps with the construction of the arguments for and against the intended interpretation of the assessment scores. The relevance of assessment data is also considered. For example, students who participate in Woodcock-Johnson assessments receive scores in age norms and grade level norms. Depending on how the assessment will be used, the assessor can interpret whether or not a student is learning at the same rate as their same age peers. Students who are assessed using the Woodcock-Johnson are compared to their same age peers who took this same assessment. Therefore, the results are valid based on the intended uses and interpretation. Testing samples and settings should be used within validation. This means that a variety of testing samples and testing settings should be used to determine if an assessment is valid. The composition of any sample size and setting should also be explained in as much detail as possible. This information should include the test taker's socio-demographics and the developmental characteristics of those test takers as well. Validation should never be based on personal opinions, but expert opinions should be used if deemed necessary. A thorough selection process is used when it comes to selecting these experts. When we talk about developmental characteristics for assessments, we can consider the North Carolina Extend 1 assessments. These assessments are administered to students who demonstrate a low intellectual ability, meaning that the samples and the sample size in which these assessments were validated are intended for students to be assessed one-on-one, and students must be identified through an individualized education plan as needing an extend one assessments. Those assessments offer students less answer choices, and the entire assessment can be read aloud to them during the one-to-one testing session. That would be an example of a testing sample and a setting used in validation, along with socio-demographics and developmental characteristics being considered. So, forms of validity evidence: the content oriented evidence, the cognitive process evidence, and the internal, structure evidence. These three evidences are used to help determine the relationship with the criteria through a process called meta-analysis. When meta-analysis is used as evidence of the strength of the test criteria and relationship, the test variables in the local situation should also be comparable to which the setting, to which the setting in which the assessment will be administered. The correspondence between those features in a local situation and the meta-analysis should also be reported. Meaning, if we have students who participate in assessments and receive accommodations of a different type of setting, that should be noted and documented within either a 504 education plan or an individualized education plan, because that would mean that we provided an accommodation to that student. Things that we need to remember: when we are administering assessments, we must follow the directions as written so that we do not jeopardize the validity of the assessments. Assessments go through a very rigorous process before they are administered to students. And not adhering to the directions of those assessments could jeopardize our ability to be able to use the assessment data when it is released. For example, within the North Carolina testing system, if you determine that a testing irregularity happened while an assessment was being administered, the data from that assessment is no longer valid and the assessment must be readministered. It is important when we are assessing students that we remember to follow the directions as written so that we do not jeopardize the validity of the assessment. Only documented accommodations should be provided, meaning that the state or the school district has approved those accommodations. If not, then we should not be using any accommodations that we feel a student needs without the proper verification and documentation of the necessity of that accommodation.